Published 1826 Est, 15 November 2017. Updated 2031 Est, 15 November 2017. Zimbabwe is under the control of the country's military after troops, who are holding President Robert Mugabe under house arrest, seized the state broadcaster, in what appeared to be a coup against the 93-year-old Mugabe, the world's oldest head of state. The military was at pains to emphasize it had not staged a military takeover, but was instead starting a process to restore Zimbabwe's democracy. The military appears to have brought an end to Mugabe's long, 37-year reign in what the army's supporters praised as a bloodless correction. Grace, his wife, is said to have fled to Namibia according to an opposition MP, though there has been no official confirmation of her whereabouts. In his first contact with the outside world since the takeover, Mugabe spoke by telephone to the President of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, and told him he was confined to his home but fine. The South African presidency said in a statement, "SOLRs and an armored vehicle are pictured on patrol on a street in Harare, Zimbabwe today." The Zimbabwean military appeared to have taken control of state institutions, saying that it was targeting criminals in the government. Zimbabwe is under the control of the country's military after troops, who are holding President Robert Mugabe under house arrest. One of his homes, pictured here, seized the state broadcaster, the £7 million custom-built mansion which has also been rumoured as Robert Mugabe's coastal bolt hole as he tries to lie low. A picture taken by lawyer Fadzayi Mahiri appeared to show a line of police officers sitting on the ground in the capital being led by SOLRS. Mahiri, who aims to be an MP in the city, took the picture from the window of her office. It is not known what happened to the men. Robert Mugabe's wife Grace, pictured together, is said to have fled to Namibia according to an opposition MP, though there has been no official confirmation of her whereabouts. It is thought the dictator is hunkered down in the Blue House, one of his many properties which is in the Borrowdale area of Harare. According to ENCA, Mugabe is now likely to be forced to hand power to his sacked vice president in a few weeks to make today's coup appear legal. Experts have claimed his wife, dubbed Gucci Grace for her love of shopping, is believed to have fled to Namibia, having been allowed to leave the country last night. Opposition MP Ed Cross told the BBC. Her location has not yet been confirmed. Deposed Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa, 75, a veteran of Zimbabwe's 1970s liberation wars who was sacked by Mugabe earlier this month, is believed to have returned from exile. The dismissal of Mnangagwa, nicknamed the Crocodile, had left Grace Mugabe, 52, in prime position to succeed her husband as the next president, a succession strongly opposed by senior ranks in the military. Derek Matisak, an analyst at the Pretoria-based Institute for Security Studies, said he believes the army will now be in negotiations with both Mugabe and Mnangagwa. The easiest way to present a veneer of legality is that Mugabe reappoints Mnangagwa as vice president. Briefly, Mugabe then retires. Under Zimbabwe's constitution, the first vice president would automatically become acting president for 90 days. South Africa and other neighboring countries were sending in leaders to negotiate with Mugabe and the generals to encourage the transition. The series of whiplash events followed Mugabe's firing last week of his deputy, which appeared to position the First Lady, Grace Mugabe, to replace Emmerson Mnangagwa as one of the country's two vice presidents at a party conference next month. But the 52-year-old First Lady is unpopular among many Zimbabweans for her lavish spending on mansions, cars and jewels. Last month she went to court to sue a diamond dealer for not supplying her with a 100-carat diamond she said she had paid for. Grace Mugabe has been known as the leader of the G40, a group of cabinet ministers and officials in their 40s and 50s who are too young to have fought in Zimbabwe's war to end white minority rule in Rhodesia. First Lady Grace Mugabe, 52, pictured with her husband, has been seen as being a successor to her husband after her opponent was fired. Mr. Mnangagwa was fired. The generals and war veterans felt they were being sidelined and took action to stop that. Analysts say Zimbabwe may enter a period of negotiation to get Mugabe to step down voluntarily, said Piers Pigu, Southern Africa consultant for the International Crisis Group, who also suggested Mnangagwa may be an interim leader. Zimbabwe could have some kind of inclusive government and some kind of democratic process, possibly leading to elections, Pigu said. It's clearly a coup d'état, but typical of Zimbabwe, the military is trying to put a veneer of legality on the process. It is part of the theater that Zimbabwe is so good at, to try to make things look orderly and democratic. South Africa and other neighboring countries may be brought in to help put some lipstick on the pig. The Zimbabwean general behind the coup may have traveled to China days before he sent his troops to Harare to seek permission to launch the takeover. General Constantine Chiwenga, the head of the army, traveled to Beijing last week and held meetings with top brass from the defense ministry. When he returned, he challenged Mugabe's sacking of his vice president, which sparked the suspected coup. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has insisted it was a routine visit, according to The Telegraph, though analysts have suggested China gave the rebellious army chief their blessing amid concerns the country is having a growing influence over Africa. Deposed Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa in the dark blue suit has been pictured after returning from exile. A military tank is seen with armed SOLRS on the road leading to President Robert Mugabe's office in Harare, Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe's military stormed the country's national broadcaster's studios last night to declare there was no coup after explosions and gunfire were heard in the capital. There were reports today that police were being beaten by SOLRS in Harare's central business district, while a picture on social media appears to show officers sitting in a line with troops guarding them. Last night, Zimbabwe's military stormed the country's national broadcaster's studios to declare it is targeting criminals. The army was praised today by the nation's influential war veterans for carrying out a bloodless correction of gross abuse of power. The military will return Zimbabwe to genuine democracy and make the country a modern model nation, said Chris Musvangwa, chairman of the War Veterans Association. Last night, the military read a statement on live TV claiming this is not a military takeover of government and said Mugabe was safe. Finance Minister Ignatius Chombo, a leading member of the so-called G40 faction of the ruling ZANU-PF party led by Mugabe's wife Grace, had also been detained by the military, a government source said. The EU this morning called for a peaceful resolution and described the crisis a matter of concern for the bloc. Britain's Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson appealed for everybody to refrain from violence. We cannot tell you how developments in Zimbabwe will play out in the days ahead, and we do not know whether this marks the downfall of Mugabe or not, Mr. Johnson told the British Parliament. Britain, Johnson said, had always wanted Zimbabwe's citizens to be masters of their fate. He said Britain would do all it could to ensure that elections next year were free and fair. We will do all we can, with our international partners, to ensure this provides a genuine opportunity for all Zimbabweans to decide their future. SOLRS stormed the headquarters of state broadcaster ZBC in the early hours of Wednesday. Two members of staff and a human rights worker told Reuters the staff complained they were manhandled by the military members. This was the scene in the center of Harare in Zimbabwe this morning as SOLRS patrolled the streets after a bloodless correction of power. Checkpoint tanks were seen on the streets of Harare this morning after it emerged that the president, Robert Mugabe, had been detained. Armed SOLRS searched a vehicle on the road leading to President Robert Mugabe's office in Harare, Zimbabwe overnight. At least 3 explosions were heard in the capital, Harare, and military vehicles were seen in the streets. 2 SOLRS sitting in a tank on the outskirts of Harare where a suspected coup took place in the early hours of Wednesday morning. Finance Minister Ignatius Chombo, a leading member of the so-called G40 faction of the ruling ZANU-PF party led by Mugabe's wife Grace, had been detained by the military, a government source said. The front gate to his property pictured was ripped off as he was detained. It has been claimed military vehicles were seen patrolling the streets of the capital Harare today after it emerged that Mugabe and his family had been arrested. Zimbabweans queue to draw money outside a bank in Harare, Zimbabwe this morning amid uncertainty following the so-called bloodless correction of power. A sign to Mugabe International Airport had been partially covered up to remove any reference to the dictator after taking control of the station. The military released a statement which denied a coup was underway, adding that Mugabe and his family were safe and their security is guaranteed. They added that the army were targeting people who were committing crimes that are causing social and economic suffering in the country. Zimbabwe Major General S.B. Moyo, Chief of Staff Logistics, said on national television, "We wish to assure the nation that His Excellency the President of the Republic of Zimbabwe, and Commander-in-Chief of Zimbabwe Defense Forces, Comrade R.G. Mugabe, and his family are safe and their security is guaranteed. We are only targeting criminals around him who are committing crimes that are causing social and economic suffering in the country in order to bring them to justice. As soon as we have accomplished our mission, we expect that the situation will return to normalcy." To the civil servants, "As you are aware, there is a plan by the same people to influence the current purging that is taking place in the political sphere to the civil service. We are against that act of injustice and we intend to protect every one of you against that." To the judiciary, "The measures underway are intended to assure that as an independent arm of the state you are able to exercise your independent authority without fear of being obstructed. As soon as we have accomplished our mission, we expect that the situation will return to normalcy." The statement continued. This morning, the TV state broadcaster played Liberation Struggle-esque while many citizens in Harare shopped at markets, drove to work or queued outside banks despite the turmoil, but there were signs that Harare may already be preparing for life after Mugabe. This morning, pictures emerged on social media showing how his name had been removed from a street sign. A sign to Mugabe International Airport had been partially covered up to remove any reference to the dictator. There was uncertainty over where Mugabe was being held this morning before South African President Jacob Zuma claimed the veteran leader was under house arrest. President Zuma spoke to President Robert Mugabe earlier today, who indicated that he was confined to his home but said that he was fine, the South African government said in a statement. Zuma, in his capacity as chair of the Southern African Development Community, is sending special envoys to Zimbabwe. South Africa will send its intelligence and defense ministers, the statement said. South Africa is Zimbabwe's powerful southern neighbor and is home to hundreds of thousands of Zimbabwean migrants. It has long pursued a policy of quiet diplomacy with Mugabe, as Zimbabwe has previously been engulfed by a string of serious political and economic crises. Tensions have been rising in the landlocked African country after Zimbabwe's head of the military, General Constantino Chiwenga, challenged Mugabe over his decision to sack Mnangagwa, nicknamed the Crocodile. The move was widely seen as a power play to make way for his wife Grace to succeed him. Mnangagwa, who has close ties to the military, had been seen as Mugabe's natural successor, and after he was ousted, he took aim at Mugabe and his supporters. Intervention. An armored personnel carrier was seen in the road by an intersection in Harare as Zimbabwean SOLRs regulate traffic in Harare. SOLRs stand guard at an intersection in Harare after the military announced leader Robert Mugabe was in custody. Armed SOLRs in armored personnel carriers stationed themselves at key points in Harare, while Zimbabweans formed long lines at banks pictured in order to draw the limited cash available, a routine chore in the country's ongoing financial crisis. Zimbabwe's army said Wednesday it has President Robert Mugabe and his wife in custody and is securing government offices and patrolling the capital's streets following a night of unrest that included a military takeover of the state. Broadcaster Hayes said ZANU-PF was controlled by undisciplined, egotistical and self-serving minnows who derive their power not from the people and the party but from only two individuals in the form of the First Family. The ruling ZANU-PF party hit back at Chiwenga's threat, saying it would never succumb to military pressure, and described the statement by the armed forces chief as treasonable conduct. Tanks had been making their way to the city center throughout Tuesday as tensions reached boiling point. Then at least 3 explosions were heard in Harare overnight, sparking fears of a coup which sent shockwaves around Zimbabwe. Armed SOLRs were also reportedly seen assaulting passers-by in the capital and loading ammunition near a group of 4 military vehicles in an unprecedented challenge to Mugabe. The Zimbabwean president's house, where gunfire was heard this morning, was also surrounded by SOLRS, but speculation suggested it was for his own protection amid suggestions his 37-year reign was coming to an end. Zimbabwe's envoy to South Africa, Isaac Moyo, had earlier reported there was no coup, adding that the government was intact. Such takeovers not looked upon favorably, the African Union. In 2015, the group hit coup leaders with sanctions a year after an uprising against Burkina Faso leader Blaise Compaoré. This afternoon, the House head, Alpha Conde, who is also Guinea's president, said the crisis seems like a coup and called on the military to halt their actions and submit to constitutional order. He added that his group condemned the actions of top brass in the southern African nation as clearly SOLRS trying to take power by force. A young man washes a minibus adorned with a picture of President Robert Mugabe this morning at a bus terminal in Harare, Zimbabwe, and SOLRS control vehicles as they stand by an intersection and they regulate civilian traffic in Harare. Armored vehicles blocked roads to the main government offices, parliament and the courts in central Harare, while taxis ferried commuters to work nearby. The 20,000 British nationals in Zimbabwe are being advised to stay indoors after tanks and SOLRS were seen on the streets of Harare. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office (FCO) issued a statement this morning also urging UK citizens to avoid political activity following rising tensions in the African country. The FCO guidance said due to the uncertain political situation in Harare, including reports of unusual military activity, we recommend British nationals currently in Harare to remain safely at home or in their accommodation until the situation becomes clearer. Roadblock: British nationals in Zimbabwe are being advised to stay indoors after tanks and SOLRS were seen on the streets of Harare. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office (FCO) issued a statement this morning also urging UK citizens to avoid political activity following rising tensions in the African country. The FCO also warned British nationals to steer clear of political activities and anything that could be considered criticism of President Mugabe for their own safety. The statement added you should avoid political activity, or activities which could be considered political, including political discussions in public places and criticism of the president. You should avoid all demonstrations and rallies. The authorities have sometimes used force to suppress demonstrations. Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson said events were being monitored closely and Britons were advised to remain at home or in accommodation until the situation is clearer. The UK's acting ambassador to Zimbabwe, Simon Thomas, said I can confirm that military remain deployed at strategic locations around Harare this morning. As an embassy, our prime concern is obviously for the safety and security of British nationals, and our advice to any British nationals who are here in Harare, either living or working or visiting, is to stay at home, stay in your hotel room, wait until things settle down a little bit. He said there had been no reports of any injuries or suffering involving the 20,000 British nationals in Zimbabwe. Meanwhile, the US Embassy in Zimbabwe warned its citizens in the country to shelter in place over the uncertainty. As a result of the ongoing political uncertainty through the night, the ambassador has instructed all employees to remain home Wednesday, the embassy in Harare said in a statement. The embassy will be minimally staffed and closed to the public. U.S. citizens in Zimbabwe are encouraged to shelter in place until further notice. In Harare in the early hours of this morning, aggressive SOLRS told passing cars to keep moving through the darkness. Don't try anything funny. Just go, one barked at a reporter on Harare Drive. 2 hours later, SOLRS overran the headquarters of the ZBC, Zimbabwe's state broadcaster and a principal Mugabe mouthpiece, and ordered staff to leave. The U.S. Embassy in Zimbabwe on Wednesday warned its citizens in the country to shelter in place due to ongoing political uncertainty as the crisis deepened. U.S. citizens in Zimbabwe are encouraged to shelter in place until further notice, the embassy in Harare said in a statement. Last night, 2 witnesses described seeing a military convoy near Westgate Shopping Center, 6 miles from central Harare. One, a fruit seller, said I saw a long convoy of military vehicles, including tanks. Zimbabwe's military seized power early on Wednesday, targeting criminals around President Robert Mugabe, but gave assurances on national television that the 93-year-old leader and his family were safe. And tensions have been rising in the landlocked African country after Zimbabwe's head of the military, General Constantino Chiwenga, challenged Mugabe over his decision to sack the Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa. Former Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa, pictured in January with wife Auxilla, 75, a veteran of Zimbabwe's 1970s liberation wars who was sacked by Mugabe earlier this month, has returned from exile. The dismissal left Mugabe's wife Grace, 52, in prime position to succeed her husband as the next president, a succession strongly opposed by senior ranks in the military. The night's action triggered speculation of a coup, but the military's supporters praised it as a bloodless correction. Overnight, 3 explosions were heard in the capital, Harare, and military vehicles were seen in the streets. Pictured armed forces. A witness saw 4 tanks heading to Harare and 2 other tanks parked beside the main road from Harare to Chinri, about 14 miles from the city. Military on the move yesterday. The head of the armed forces, Constantino Chiwenga, openly threatened to intervene in politics if Mugabe did not stop removing veterans from government. Robert Mugabe's legacy as one of the most ruthless tyrants of modern times will remain long after his days as notorious statesman of Zimbabwe are over. What could turn out to be the 93-year-old leader's final night in charge of the troubled South African nation concluded in typically chaotic fashion, with the army saying it had Mugabe and his ambitious wife Grace in custody following a takeover of the state broadcaster. Tensions escalated after the First Lady appeared to be positioned to replace Mugabe's recently fired deputy Emmerson Mnangagwa, leading many in Zimbabwe to suspect she could eventually succeed her husband. The elderly politician's second wife after Sarah Hayfrindi in 1992 remained unpopular with some Zimbabweans because of her lavish spending, including in London's plush stores, while many around her struggled against the country's crippling economy. Aging Zimbabwe's President Robert Mugabe, 93, who has been in power since 1980, is in increasingly fragile health and makes regular trips abroad for medical treatment. Tensions over the succession of Mugabe recently erupted into the open, and had pitched First Lady Grace Mugabe against now-sacked Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa. Mugabe's savage rule over Zimbabwe was dominated by murder, bloodshed, torture, persecution of political opponents, intimidation and voter rigging on a grand scale. He was the man who, in 1980, became the head of government of Zimbabwe, chosen to guide the country towards democracy after 14 years of rebellion against the crown headed by white Southern Rhodesian leader Ian Smith. Much of Mugabe's dirty work was carried out by his bullying henchmen, veterans of the guerrilla war against the Smith regime. They attacked and often murdered white farmers, burning their homes, looting their possessions and confiscating their land, while his political opponents were often beaten, usually abused and sometimes charged with treason and homicide offenses. The economy of this mineral-rich country descended into chaos, with thousands of people reduced to grinding poverty, many of them suffering from near starvation and worse. Mugabe's relationship with the Commonwealth, which he dubbed an Anglo-Saxon unholy alliance, was always stormy. Zimbabwe was suspended from the Commonwealth in March 2002 after Mugabe was denounced for voter rigging his own re-election. During the Commonwealth Heads of Government Conference a year later, he quit the organization while member states were arguing about Zimbabwe's future. In 1980, Mugabe, shown in 2005, became the head of government of Zimbabwe, chosen to guide the country towards democracy after 14 years of rebellion against the crown headed by white Southern Rhodesian leader Ian Smith. Princess Diana is pictured meeting President Robert Mugabe during a British royal visit to Zimbabwe in 1993. Robert Gabriel Mugabe was born on February 24, 1924 in Kutama. He was educated at Kutama Mission School and Fort Hare University and obtained degrees in correspondence courses with other educational establishments, including London University. He worked as a teacher at various schools in Zimbabwe, a Southern Rhodesia as it was then, and in neighbouring countries. Mugabe became publicity secretary of the National Democratic Party in 1960 and the following year was appointed acting Secretary General of the Zimbabwe African People's Union, which was eventually banned. He suffered political detention in 1962 and the following year co-founded and became Secretary General of ZANU. Again he was sentenced, without trial, to political detention in 1964, but escaped in 1974 to Mozambique, from where he led the armed struggle against the regime right up to 1979, when, through Lord Christopher Soames, Margaret Thatcher brokered a deal in 1979 to end the Ian Smith Rebellion. To everyone's surprise, the Marxist Mugabe, with what was described as a mix of conciliatory and intimidatory rhetoric, became Prime Minister from 1980 to 1987. From 1988 he was President of Zimbabwe. The new government, anxious to attract foreign investment, declared that white farmers were a welcome and integral part of the new Zimbabwe. Then the land seizures took place. Plans to redistribute land PC were not working and ultimately the wartime veterans were sent in to dispossess the white farmers of their land, often violently. Mugabe's savage rule over Zimbabwe was dominated by murder, bloodshed, torture, persecution of political opponents, intimidation and voter rigging on a grand scale. He is pictured with his wife Sally S. In 1987. In many cases the fertile land went to rack and ruin, leading to acute food shortages and a dramatic downturn in Zimbabwe's economy. Meanwhile, as Mugabe grew into his 70s he became paranoid. He believed his opponents were trying to kill him. Any voice of dissidence was met with violence and, in the case of an independent newspaper, shut down. Political enemies were accused of homoality and thrown into jail. Peter Tatchell, the human rights campaigner, was assaulted by Mugabe's bodyguards in 2001 when he tried to make a citizen's arrest on the Zimbabwean leader. The sanctions imposed on the country at one stage barred Mugabe and his family and supporters from visiting Britain. But despite an EU travel ban, he was allowed to attend the funeral of Pope John Paul II in Rome in 2005. While there he shook hands with the Prince of Wales, who was seated one place away from the president. Clarence House said Charles was caught by surprise when Mugabe leaned over to greet him. Under Mugabe many humble Zimbabweans became billionaires, but ones on the brink of starvation and unable to pay for fuel because their money was worth so little thanks to stratospheric inflation. In 2008 and 2009, the state central bank printed so much of its currency, the Zimbabwe dollar, that the country experienced mind-boggling hyperinflation that reached 500 billion%, according to the International Monetary Fund. The result was that items such as a loaf of bread would often cost millions of Zimbabwean dollars. In 2008 Mugabe was stripped of his honorary knighthood, awarded in 1994, over his abuse of human rights and abject disregard for democracy, the Foreign Office said at the time. The Queen approved the annulment. Inflation was only brought under control when the government abandoned the Zimbabwe currency and used the US dollar as its main medium of trade. Last year this was replaced with a new currency called bond notes. As his dictatorial reign continued, many voiced their concerns about the power-obsessed leader. The then Archbishop of York, John Sentamu, cut up his dog collar on live television in a dramatic protest. In 2008 Mugabe was stripped of his honorary knighthood, awarded in 1994, over his abuse of human rights and abject disregard for democracy, the Foreign Office said at the time. The Queen approved the annulment, but he was admired by some. In late 2015 he was awarded China's alternative to the Nobel Peace Prize, the Confucius Peace Prize, for what its committee called his inspired national leadership and service to Pan-Africanism. Mugabe had 2 sons and 1 daughter with Grace, while his first marriage produced 1 son who died. Zimbabwe president's long rule at a glance. 1980 Mugabe named prime minister after independence elections. 1982 military action begins in Matabeleland against perceived uprising. Government is accused of killing thousands of civilians. 1987 Mugabe changes constitution and becomes president. 1994 Mugabe receives honorary British knighthood. 2000 land seizures of white-owned farms begin. Western donors cut off aid. 2005 United States calls Zimbabwe an outpost of tyranny. 2008, Mugabe and opposition candidate Morgan Tsvangirai agree to share power after contested election. Britain's Queen Elizabeth II annuls Mugabe's honorary knighthood. 2011, Prime Minister Tsvangirai declares power sharing a failure amid violence. 2013, Mugabe wins 7th term. Opposition alleges election fraud. 2016, This flag protest movement emerges. Independence war veterans turn on Mugabe, calling him dictatorial. 2017, Mugabe begins campaigning for 2018 elections. November 6, Mugabe fires Deputy Emmerson Mnangagwa, appearing to position First Lady Grace Mugabe for vice president post. November 15, Army announces it has Mugabe and his wife in custody as military appears to take control. Social media users said the army headquarters in the city centre were sealed off, with no one allowed in or out, and that roadblocks were in place outside the barracks of the Presidential Guard. Others said they had seen tanks heading towards the Presidential Guard compound in the western suburb of Javarakwa. Conflicting reports from the impoverished southern African country claimed the borders had been sealed and the airport shut. The military has been a key pillar of Mugabe's regime and has helped him keep control despite economic ruin, widespread anti-government protests, opposition challenges and international sanctions. But there has been growing disquiet over threats against senior figures inside ZANU-PF, including Mr. Mnangagwa. The veteran of the 70s war that led to the country's independence fell from favor after he spoke out against a party faction led by Mrs. Mugabe, saying it was plundering the country. After Mugabe accused him of using witchcraft in a plot to take power, Mr. Mnangagwa fled the country with his family, but vowed to return and lead a rebellion against the Mugabes, backed by the country's war veterans and armed forces. Before he went into exile, Mr. Mnangagwa told Mugabe that ZANU-PF was not personal property for you and your wife to do as you please. Zimbabwe's First Lady has been a divisive figure since marrying Robert Mugabe in a lavish ceremony in 1996. The influence of 52-year-old Grace Mugabe, dubbed Gucci Grace for her love of shopping, has grown over the years to the point where she was being lined up as a potential successor to her husband. But the former secretary, who was expecting to be appointed vice president at a party congress next month, is widely loathed in her homeland. Her recent escapades include seeing a journalist detained for saying she'd donated used underwear to supporters, and relying on diplomatic immunity to evade charges for assaulting a model in South Africa. Zimbabwe's First Lady Grace Mugabe has been a divisive figure since marrying Robert Mugabe in a lavish ceremony in 1996. The couple are pictured together in 2004. The 52-year-old, 41 years younger than her husband, has bought homes in Dubai and South Africa, spent £3 million of state funds on her daughter's wedding, and recently bought a £300,000 Rolls-Royce. Grace began an affair with Robert Mugabe while working as one of his typists and while his first wife, Sally, was terminally ill. He is said to have wooed Grace Marufu over tea and scones. They went on to marry in an extravagant ceremony in 1996. Her 3 sons, one from a previous marriage, angered Zimbabweans by flaunting their wealth. The 52-year-old, 41 years younger than her husband, has bought homes in Dubai and South Africa, spent £3 million of state funds on her daughter's wedding, and recently bought a £300,000 Rolls-Royce. One receipt posted showed a single night's spending of $3,000, 3 times the average annual income. The youngest recently filmed himself pouring expensive champagne over a diamond-encrusted, bragging he owned the timepiece because daddy runs the whole country. In her earlier years as Mugabe's wife, Grace had been known as a quiet figure known for her shopping and charity work. But she became increasingly involved in politics and Mugabe named her head of the ruling ZANU-PF party's women's wing in 2014. She has always been a key supporter of her husband, but admitted in 2014, "They say I want to be president. Why not? Am I not a Zimbabwean?" His ousting was widely interpreted as a bid to ensure Mrs. Mugabe would become vice president at a special conference of the ruling party next month, leaving her as the natural successor to her husband as president. Surrounded by 90 senior army officers, General Chiwenga called this week for an end to the sacking of senior figures linked to the party's revolution against white minority rule in the 70s. He said, "We must remind those behind the current treacherous shenanigans that when it comes to matters of protecting our revolution, the military will not hesitate to step in." Mugabe had previously warned military leaders against interfering in the fight for succession. In July, he told supporters, "Politics shall always lead the guns, and not the gun politics. Otherwise it will be a coup." Opposition politicians have said a military coup would damage Zimbabwe because it would be undemocratic. Last night the Foreign Office updated its advice for people traveling to Zimbabwe, warning Zimbabwe Army Chief Constantino Chiwenga addresses a media conference in Harare on Monday. A number of tanks were seen heading for the Zimbabwean capital of Harare on Tuesday, a day after the head of the armed forces threatened to intervene. At least 3 loud explosions echoed across central Harare in the early hours of Wednesday after troops seized the state broadcaster, prompting speculation of a coup. This was the scene along Robert Mugabe Road in Harare last night as the country's military appeared to seize control of the country. July, Robert Mugabe warned military leaders against interfering in the fight for succession, saying, "Politics shall always lead the guns, and not the gun politics. Otherwise it will be a coup." November 6, Vice President Emerson Mnangagwa, nicknamed the Crocodile, is fired by Mugabe. November 13, Zimbabwe's head of the military says he could step in to end President Mugabe's purge of opponents. November 14, ruling ZANU-PF party to hit back, saying it would never succumb to military pressure, and described the statement by the armed forces chief as treasonable conduct. It said, "We are aware of reports of military vehicles moving on the outskirts of Harare. We are monitoring the situation closely. You should avoid political activity, or activities which could be considered political, including political discussions in public places and criticism of the president. You should avoid all demonstrations and rallies. The authorities have sometimes used force to suppress demonstrations." Mugabe is the only leader Zimbabwe has known in 37 years of independence, first as the chair of the Zimbabwe African National Union ZANU, then as leader of the ZANU party as prime minister and then president. Under Mugabe's leadership, the GDP of Zimbabwe has fallen by almost 50%, according to the United Nations. The country suffered badly during the recession and experienced hyperinflation and a widespread lack of food and other essentials. Things have slightly recovered, but are still significantly worse than when the family took power. Meanwhile, the Mugabes themselves live their lives bathing in eye-watering luxury. The couple's 2 sons, Chatunga and his brother Robert Jr., are well known for their hard partying and have been seen flashing their riches on social media. This week Chatunga posted a video of himself pouring hundreds of pounds worth of champagne over a £45,000 diamond-encrusted wrist. The brothers caused an international incident earlier this year while in South Africa, after they disappeared on a wild night out, prompting Mrs. Mugabe to go looking for them. Finding 20-year-old model Gabriella Engels instead, Mrs. Mugabe allegedly beat her over the head with an electrical plug when she was unable to say where the boys had gone. That led to a warrant being issued for her arrest, though she was eventually granted diplomatic immunity and allowed to leave the country. Mrs. Mugabe is currently suing a Lebanese jeweler for failing to deliver a £1 million diamond ring she bought to mark her 21st wedding anniversary with a dictator. Is the crocodile any better than Mugabe? Deposed vice president who has seized power in Zimbabwe is a London-educated former spymaster who orchestrated 1980s massacre of 20,000 opponents by Ian Burns for Mail Online. Mnangagwa, pictured with Mugabe, 75, has had a long and varied political career, leading at one point the Justice, Defense, Housing and Finance ministries as well as being the Speaker of the lower house and spymaster, the man believed to be behind the events in Zimbabwe today is the country's recently sacked Vice President, Emerson Mnangagwa, also known as the Crocodile. Mnangagwa, 75, is a notorious and much-feared figure in Zimbabwe, having led a vicious crackdown on opponents in the 1980s with the help of the dreaded North Korean-trained 5th Army Brigade. Thousands of civilians were killed during the Gukurahundi campaign, but Mnangagwa has always denied involvement. His reputation for cruelty is so legendary that he was one of the few leaders of Zimbabwe known to drive around the country without security. He is also known for his unpredictable darting eyes. He has had a long and varied political career, leading at one point the Justice, Defense, Housing and Finance ministries as well as being the Speaker of the lower house and a spymaster. Mnangagwa was widely viewed as Mugabe's successor until he was ditched by the president last week and fled to South Africa. Mugabe had accused his former deputy of plotting to take power from him, while his ambitious wife Grace referred to him as a snake that must be hit on the head after the two clashed. But Mnangagwa, who recently survived a poisoning attempt blamed on ice cream from Mugabe's own dairy, has been telling allies he would return rapidly and everything would soon be sorted. He is a leader of the so-called Lacoste faction named after the clothes firm's crocodile logo, which matches Mnangagwa's reptilian nickname within Mugabe's party. The group enjoys strong support among military figures. It is locked in a struggle with Grace's G40 group. With the events of today, the struggle between Grace and Mnangagwa to succeed 93-year-old Mugabe appears to be shifting in the crocodile's favor. University of London educated Mnangagwa has been close to Mugabe since the two were side by side in the struggle against racist white minority rule in then Rhodesia. In 1983, Mnangagwa led a major crackdown in Matabeleland, in the southwest of Zimbabwe. Tens of thousands of people were killed. Pictured boss found in Matabeleland after the massacre. Mnangagwa was mentioned by, among others, the tycoon Roland at the time of the Gukurahundi massacres. Pictured Mugabe Center and Mnangagwa right together. Mnangagwa's reputation for cruelty is so legendary that he was one of the few leaders of Zimbabwe known to drive around the country without security. Pictured the former vice president collapse after being presented with a fake crocodile as homage to his nickname. Mnangagwa was sentenced to 10 years in jail, being kept at Salisbury Prison, Grey Prison, Kami Prison and Harare Prison. While imprisoned in Salisbury, later renamed Harare, he became close to Mugabe and other nationalist leaders. Pictured Mnangagwa with Mugabe and Josiah Tongagera, a guerrilla commander. He is a leader of the so-called Lacoste faction named after the clothes firm's crocodile logo, which matches Mnangagwa's reptilian nickname within Mugabe's party. The group enjoys strong support among military figures. Pictured Mugabe with Mnangagwa not long after ZANU-PF, modern Zimbabwe's ruling party, was formed in 1963. Mnangagwa was sent for military training in communist China. He earned his crocodile nickname when he returned to Zimbabwe and led a gang of fighters called the Crocodile Group during the Civil War. The gang blew up several trains during their operations against the Rhodesian government and, as a consequence, Mnangagwa was arrested in 1965. He confessed to revolutionary activity and was savagely tortured, but escaped the death penalty after successfully arguing that, because he was under 21, he should not be executed. Instead, he was sentenced to 10 years in jail, being kept at Salisbury Prison, Grey Prison, Kami Prison and Harare Prison. After Mugabe won the election of 1980 and became Zimbabwe's first prime minister, there were fears a potential takeover of the country by the Ndebele ethnic minority may be afoot. In 1983, Mnangagwa led a major crackdown in Matabeleland, in the southwest of Zimbabwe. Matabeleland was the stronghold of Mugabe's political rival, Joshua Nkomo. Mugabe blamed members of Nkomo's party for a series of murders and attacks on property in the country. During the operation between 1983 and 1987, later known as the Gukurahundi, the early rain which washes away the before the spring rains, tens of thousands of civilians were killed. The agreement between North Korea and Mugabe for the training of the 5th Brigade was signed in October 1980, when the Zimbabwean Prime Minister met with Kim Il-sung. Pictured the 5th Brigade in 1982 at Independence Day celebrations in Salisbury. The banner overhead read, "Let us lay down our lives for CDE." RG Mugabe. The North Korean-trained 5th Brigade was responsible for the atrocities, which also included the torture and rape of tens of thousands in Matabeleland. Showing that they had learned from their communist teachers, the 5th Brigade troops summarily detained and executed Ndebele men of fighting age, who were automatically deemed guilty of subversion. Many were also marched to re-education camps, a popular tactic employed by Stalinist North Korea as well as Communist China. The North Korean trained 5th Brigade picture training in 1984 was responsible for the atrocities, which also included the torture and rape of tens of thousands of in Matabeleland on one occasion. In March of 1983, the 5th Brigade slaughtered 55 people apparently at random on the banks of the Swale River. The SOLRS reportedly forced their victims to dig their own graves before being shot. The agreement between North Korea and Mugabe for the training of the 5th Brigade was signed in October 1980, when the Zimbabwean Prime Minister met with Kim Il-sung. Over 100 North Koreans arrived a year later to train the elite troops. The agreement between North Korea and Mugabe for the training of the 5th Brigade was signed in October 1980, when the Zimbabwean Prime Minister met with Kim Il-sung. Pictured the two dictators meeting in 1993, but by 1988, the reputation of the brigade, whose SOLRS were identifiable by their distinctive red berets, was deemed so toxic that it was disbanded. None of the perpetrators of the atrocities has ever been brought to justice, with those implicated including Mugabe and Mnangagwa. Mnangagwa was mentioned by, among others, the tycoon Roland at the time of the massacres. He rose to the U.S. ambassador that Mnangagwa, as security minister, was aware of the slaughter going on in the country's south. While imprisoned in Salisbury, later renamed Harare, he became close to Mugabe and other nationalist leaders. After being deported to Zambia, Mnangagwa studied law and in the late 1970s became a senior member of ZANU-PF. When Zimbabwe became independent in 1980, Mnangagwa was named as Prime Minister Mugabe's national security chief. 7 years later, when Mugabe made himself president, Mnangagwa was made justice minister. His loyalty to Mugabe was rewarded in 2000 when, having lost his seat in parliament, he was appointed to an unelected seat and made Speaker of the lower house. Zimbabweans sitting in front of Salisbury prison in 1968 after the triple hanging of James Dlamini, Victor Malambo and Julie Shadrack, was ordered by Ian Smith's government despite Queen Elizabeth II issuing a royal reprieve. Mugabe had accused his former deputy of plotting to take power from him, while his ambitious wife Grace referred to him as a snake that must be hit on the head after the two clashed. Pictured right. Mnangagwa with Mugabe in 2004. University of London educated. Mnangagwa has been close to Mugabe since the two were involved in the struggle against racist white minority rule in then Rhodesia. Pictured Mnangagwa right. Being sworn in as vice president by Mugabe left in 2014. He earned his crocodile nickname when he returned to Zimbabwe and led a gang of fighters called the Crocodile Group during the Civil War. Pictured Mnangagwa in 2016. Mnangagwa repaid Mugabe for his support during the 2008 elections, with a crocodile said to have steered the president to victory after Morgan Tsvangirai won the first round. Hundreds of Tsvangirai supporters were killed in the political violence blamed on Mugabe's regime, forcing Tsvangirai to step aside and giving Mugabe a clear run at the presidency. Mnangagwa was then made defense minister and, in 2013, vice president. He appeared to be on course to become the country's next leader, but First Lady Grace Mugabe did not approve. Last month she warned of a possible coup being orchestrated by Vice President Mnangagwa amid a heated power struggle. She claimed his allies were threatening to kill people who did not support his bid to succeed Mugabe. Grace recently told supporters in 1980 this person called Mnangagwa wanted to stage a coup. He wanted to wrestle power from the president. He was conspiring with whites. That man is a ravisher. His loyalty to Mugabe was rewarded in 2000 when, having lost his seat in parliament, he was appointed to an unelected seat and made Speaker of the lower house.